Hello. It's very important to me to share with you the sum of my thoughts from the teaching experience, the earnest desire to communicate to the student the full information about the style, the expectation, the very substance of the thought of the composer, as subjective as that can be. And it is. Through the reading of the score and then the interpretation, literally the translation of the indications, which by the fact that they are not written in the pitches and the rhythmic figures, they leave room for exaggeration for some or for minimization for others. How much a ritardando, how much an accelerando, in which context, how does it merge into another section? Is it a bridge? Is it part of a formal organization only? Or is it also intuitive, emotional, harmonic, mood setting? And to a certain extent, I'm very convinced after all these years of teaching that nothing replaces the power of love, in the sense of let yourself, like you inhale the beauty of the music that you receive, regardless if you can dissect it in an analytical slices of different aspects that you can then compare and contrast stylistically and the harmonically, and then the voicing and the texture, and then the evolution of the style given the time period and how other composers wrote, and what is a dissonance, what's a consonance, what is in any case the language which is used to express humanity, to express will, hope, desire, sometimes anxiety in hoping or fearing it, as well as reaching that climax that we all want, the plenitude of things to happen, or then the avoidance of it in order to reach another level of spiritual and not only exaltation of the senses, but rather a spiritual elevation of the elements, which don't call for a climax, but rather for a continuous developmental expression of the blossoming voices or structured parts of the writing for piano, that is either contrapuntal, either quartet-like, either orchestral, in Beethoven's case fragmented or symphonically, or in a modern way for his time, really developing Haydnian ideas about how to break, develop, and involve the developmental aspect of the thematic material to its repetitive core element, almost like the nucleus element, like a single note or three notes in a row, something very basic that is part of the element of a theme. And he does the bridge. To return to the recap of this sonata opus 90, not searching for something per se beautiful like he does in scales, or he could do in arpeggio, and that Mozart did and Haydn did. But Beethoven, unlike Mozart, who is really the most natural child of Haydn, so to say, musically, Mozart develops nothing in his thematic development of the sonata form, or at least he does so little that he shows to us that it's all about charming our hearts with melodic lines which are unbelievably unforgettable. There isn't one theme of Mozart that you can play randomly that doesn't suffice by itself, like in an aria or a quartet. With lyrics in opera, without lyrics in instrumental, have the same impactful, emotional, human, lyrical connection which in a way he develops, I was going to say he displays and develops, came up the two words collided, sorry, in my mouth and brain. He does display them, he doesn't develop them, he doesn't chop them and organize them in different ways. He doesn't like to play the development game. He's interested only in displaying them in several keys, and then with a very graceful bridge he returns, like Schubert would do in the Fifth Symphony. I purposely, my brain went to an example by Schubert, the most intuitive composer of that era, compared to Beethoven, who, like a sculptor, struggles through the material until he extracts the most meaningful humanity from it, which touches our humanity, and we feel that struggle and the beauty of the result of reaching of the struggle to the point where we have found something that makes us better for our condition, instead of this predestined Spinozian, if you want, destiny of life, where we are the puppets of a puppeteer, and therefore inevitably everything is destiny, and some of us are having the grace upon them that, like Mozart used to say when asked, I don't sketch, I just think, and then I write down directly, as if dictated by God. Of course, that's easy to say for us to not understand. I mean, we can say concepts, but they don't mean much. But we can feel and connect to the struggle, because we as humans, at least I do, and I'm sure most of us, struggle. But with willpower and organization, meaning a lot of, well, basically drive and discipline, at least for those who have it, we can shape the raw material of whatever we are trying to achieve and extract the heart of it, the meaning of it, and bring to the world a beautiful scientific research, a beautiful artistic projection of humanity or of imagination, or make an incredible, beautiful storytelling through a novel, a film, a video game, whatever format it takes. In other words, some kind of experience of humanity through music, in the case of piano works, where, as disconnected as they are from a specific story because there are no lyrics, and as disconnected as they are from the orchestral timbres, colorizations, which then can suggest different characters between the thinness of a sound, the thickness of the sound, or some kind of profound sound. Of course, the piano is, the modern piano at least, has all these 8 octaves, and it has that screamy top or whisper top, and this boomy bass where the resonance is so wide that you barely hear the pitch, and then that middle, and you have a capacity of playing repertoires way beyond the piano, which is the great advantage of the modern piano. Of course, in the eyes of the scholar purists, who insist, rightfully so, when you study the so-called performance practice knowledge of the time past, of course you can do that on the instrument for which the pieces were composed. You can't play a Rachmaninoff sonata on the harpsichord, but you can play a Frescobaldi toccata on the piano. And naturally, it will not be but possibly treason to the original piece meant for, let's say, organ or harpsichord in Baroque music. However, the length of sound and the capacity of projecting shadows and lights for the voicing makes you able to translate a certain, perhaps a little, well, very transformed aesthetic of what the original tempi would have been, in order to reach a higher expression level of dimension, which possibly is a caricature for the purists who prefer it on the original instruments for which they were meant. But then again, the universality of the intent of a given composer or writer. In that sense, when language also evolves from ancient days to modern days, some languages disappear, some evolve, some and the writings, even if they're quoted in the language of their day, they have a universality in their message, just like spiritual message for religious purposes is more universal than only the original way of its display in ancient Latin, Greek, or other for the Christianity, for instance. And yes, of course, it has a mystique to it. And I understand that if we are stuck to the performance practice understanding, then we'll be obliged, if playing on the modern piano, the sort of universal instrument that plays or can play all the styles, though in its own way they become something different. It's almost as if saying, of course, post-mortem, it's a cheesy thing to do, and it's easy to think of it because it's, of course, chronologically oxymoron. But anyway, if Beethoven was here, he would have this and that. If Bach had heard this instrument, he would have done differently this and that. You won't repeat some sounds because of decay. You wouldn't ornament some sounds because of decay. But did you ornament only because of decay? Or did you really repeat harmonically common tones only because of decay? Probably not. I actually am convinced not. I think that the composers are not prisoners of their means, but their means of expression is what they are given in a serendipitous situation of the time where they lived. In Beethoven's case, he was 30 in 1800 when he started writing sonatas for piano forte directly. And not for a harpsichord or pianoforte into pianoforte. It was directly from pianoforte onwards. So that gave a different perspective to his writing, even if the texture is string quartetish and symphonic in terms of the idiom of the language, and not immediately pianistic in the sense of what Liszt and Chopin and Schumann and Brahms would bring in the later Romanticism, which Beethoven de facto in the later part of his life really started, opened that door to expressing the feelings over the form, expressing the expression of moods over the only thematic development, though he is a great proponent of it. But I still think that it was an inevitable march of time, so to say, forward, where you go from music that is for a purpose between church and then outside of sacred and the profane, and then afterwards music becoming a necessity for the cultivated uplifting of the rich elite of Western European societies, basically when humans were at some point in some societies able to think beyond survival, they could start thinking aesthetics, and they could start thinking about telling eternal stories through opera or through ballet or through expressions of the body or the instrument that the body is, or through instruments that interact with the body as extensions, like the strings, especially imitating the voice. The piano, being a hammer instrument, is probably the least obvious for that. But because of the length of sound and the pedal, it obtains this capacity of length of sound plus extended power with the steel strings and the capacity of the iron cast that gives the instrument way more projection over a whole orchestra, when the concerto in the Baroque was really a soloist stepping out slightly in front of the orchestra, but is part of the group and it blends with the group. Whenever that soloistic impression came from the piano, which was the only instrument that was not in the orchestra when orchestra composers wrote concerti for piano. There is no piano in the orchestra usually. well, Ravel introduced the harp in the concerto, which was for piano, the G major one, which was already a first, but in the early 20th century. But when you write a violin concerto, an oboe concerto, there is oboe in the orchestra, and there are violins in the orchestra, or a cello, etc. And so, meanwhile, the volume rapport is not so much important in this concerto. It's more about the expression of the phrasing and the singing and the capacity of aria or dance, which are generally sing or dance, the two types of instrumental writing which came out from the Baroque suites of dances and corresponding to the different aspects of musical usage in the profane. You dance on music, you celebrate dancing on music, or you have courtly dance of music, which is then a social element and then a political element, while also later in the early 20th century, a folkloric pride of countries that became independent when big empires broke down, and then used some of their dances as a sense of pride and folkloric originality. And Chopin's mazurkas and Liszt's Hungarian rhapsodies were at that time, so to say, aligned with that budding moment where these countries will be independent from the empires in which they're englobed. But generally speaking, the pure music, the sonata form or the fugue, which are not danced or sung, or imitating the dance, or imitating the singing, or if not, emulating it, since the harpsichord was mostly used as a rehearsal instrument for arias or rehearsal with instruments when church organs couldn't be moved out, obviously. The pianos became the instrument of the home music, the so-called chamber music, the so-called music played not so much for an audience, though there were, but mostly the rich patrons, donors. It was more like, as they used to call it, reading sessions, where composers would write a piece for the soirée or the evening of some rich patron, and eventually an enlightened amateur patron who would play with the others, like Mozart played viola with Van Hal on the cello, and given prince or given count would play perhaps another of the string instruments, and they would read a quartet facing each other on two double stands. So it's the audience listens to it, but it's not played for the audience, it's played for each other, for the music that they produce. In other words, for the industry of music making, the craftsmanship. And then when it's written artfully, the spiritual beauty shines on each of the performers who discovers it by playing their own part, none of them having the part of the all, except the pianist when they started playing with piano chamber music in these societies or salons, and read music like this, when the piano, by its essence with the two hands, it's a polyphonic instrument or a symphonic style instrument. And then the cello, violin, or flute, clarinet, oboe, or French horn instruments would be combined or in groups or in 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 with the piano. Would have, of course, the thematic lyrical aria material, since they are monodic instruments by essence, and then the harmonic while contrapuntal possible piano instrument also in volume becomes not the continuo that blends in on the harpsichord harmonizing in trio sonatas because of the volume in which it blends by the plucked string. But the hit string with the hammer, the piano, then becomes louder and bigger and thicker and richer, and the sound is more not only long in terms of decay, though it decays inevitably from the get-go, but you have the impression that the piano fulfills a lot of instrumental, symphonic or voice, emulates all these. It's an emanation of all the instrumental instruments, in fact. Yeah, I mean, even the voice is an instrument, which it is. and but doesn't need to breathe, doesn't need to change bow, doesn't have the limitations of the length of the bow or the capacity of sustaining slowly the bow for a given amount of notes. In other words, the tempi become a different choice for pianists. An adagio means what probably is an andante for a string player, or perhaps for a singer who would have to sing something very calm if the text calls for it, like in German lieders with Ruhe for peace or a serene feeling. But if they have a certain amount of beats before they run out of breath, they would ask the pianist to speed it up, and you have to do it while keeping the calm and not giving the agitation while not slowing down. Playing alone on the piano, you can exponentially expand the, or in a way unnaturally, if not even in a way, in full ways, unnaturally stretch the phrase, but then it becomes an aestheticism which is almost narcissism, because you can, should you, or could you accept to be able to play the pace more than the phrasing in terms of the expression, and then contain within the pulse and the continuous pulse of a piece the different aspects of the expression. It's like practicing, and often pianists are told practice with the metronome, so at least the best is to use the metronome as a monitor. If you keep the tempo for different sections of a movement that has a single tempo pulse throughout with different characters like thematic materials, bridges in modulations, developments, cadences, possible ritordandos, if indicated or suggested or perhaps just felt and played. Regardless, in other words, the rubato is not something that you impose, it's something that you accept to allow in order to keep some kind of track that brings you forward into your statement. In other words, it's all about the narration and how much you are inclined to take little side turns before you continue on the. In other words, you have to be through the piece, which is the storytelling. You are the storyteller, and so you cannot make it up because it's not your story to tell, it's the other person's story to tell, but while you tell it, it becomes yours. And of course, in order to maintain that kind of it's almost a rectitude of the mind, is that yes, we don't want to oblige, but we don't want to give up either to the expression. How much do we accept to get out of tracks, and then how do we return on tracks, and how much do we allow the poco meno mosso, the di più, or the and that, I think, usually is if you practice anything, if it's legato or if it's something staccato, you should always count loud voice when you practice staccato. That's what I found works best when I suggest to students, because this way, like, you practice often and you practice a section over and over, basically repeat it, hopefully with the practicing techniques of rhythms or hold and poke, or well, all kinds of ways to work on the independence of the fingers until you get a certain level of muscular memory, which is what you aim towards when you practice repetitively. So when you play, you don't have to control every 16th or 32nd of the notes. You just watch it happen, but you still organize the phrasing. Nevertheless, you have to count. If not, you'll be zigzagging the tempo. And the metronome is not on when you perform in performance throughout the piece for audience or yourself or friends, or just for the piece itself. So then, yes, you have to count staccato and independently directing your playing in order to practice loud voice counting, and then count in your head while you play in the way of the muscular memory for the repeated finger technique. It becomes a mental organization of your muscular memory for the fingers. This is the cognitive memory, organizing the hands and the organization of the pedal and the phrasing and all what you want to do in the piece. Thinking ahead, like a conductor beating ahead and the orchestra following on the beat. But of course, the orchestra plays individually parts. You play all the parts and you have to conduct yourself and you have to allow yourself freedom to express the music without to be rigid within the beats, but also within a structured phrasing with a direction line, arrival point, which justifies your narrative storytelling. And it has to sound spontaneous while organized. It has to be organized without to be pedantic. It has to be sounding fresh instead of being just rehashed and replayed for the 100th time or 1000th time or 10,000th time in order to play in front of an audience as you practiced, which is the worst idea, because it can't happen. Because of the fact that when you play in front of people, you're in another state of mind. Your emotions, everybody, of course, differently has different ways to deal with their anxiety, excitement, or combined, what they call stage fright. So the unexpected will happen, which is why the muscular memory comes handy, because it gives you a sense of assurance that no matter what, things will go well in terms of I will play it accurately. And that gives you a sense of self-confidence, not overconfidence, but enough confidence to be able to plan in real time what you do with the piece, which you display like a 3D blueprint in front of the audience, ephemerally disappearing as soon as played, regardless how well or how bad. Unfortunately, when it's bad, it seems to stay more in the memory because we're so frustrated that, or humiliated, or perhaps even angry at ourselves for all these hours and years of practicing that go down the drain in a single moment on stage. But that is also part of the excitement and disappointment that can happen. But once you get above the details in terms of the expectation of the direction of the line, how you organize the storytelling, the phrasing, the eloquent storytelling through the rhetoric, and of course the technique for the tempi is also the desire for the musical expression, also the excitement of the virtuosity of different time periods is different when you play, or obviously between Bach and Chopin is equally difficult and equally different, because in one case you have to combine power, in other hands, in other one only precision, and possibly power and precision in the ballad, and that was missed. Sorry for that. And then if you do it. So does it mean that it's easier? Of course not. That only people who don't have enough, having tried, would not know. You're more exposed with less notes, because each of them is more heard, and therefore each imperfection is more obvious, like a stain on something very bright. But beyond the inevitable worry about the so-called I call it at least dictatorship of the wrong note, I think is to do with inner drive to express oneself at its fullest for what it means to you. In other words, all your life is in one note, not because literally it is the case, but because in a way you prepare all your studies for something you love in order to serve it at its best, in the hope that at one day, at some point of the merging synthesis or synergy of the elements between your concentration, your musical expression, and meaning, as well as your technical means, being all in the same person, self-conducting yourself, self-orchestrating yourself, in fact, demultiplying yourself in many orchestra musicians who individually will play the sections that are hinted on the piano by its capacity to play polyphonic and chordal and all that with the 10 fingers on the 88 keys and the pedals. It gives a false impression of course, solitude or superiority by the pure energy that it produces. But in fact, most of the repertoire is not written for the instrument for which we play, are probably most likely for the tastes of the today's psyche and ears of the listeners, of the recording engineers, of the roaring orchestras, of the concert halls that call for bigger pianos that project more and lightly in touch and powerful in length of sound, or perhaps in projecting sound. That in fact we constantly overserve the pieces that we play, even if we know that they're not for this instrument, and most of them aren't, on which we play it. But it becomes the medium, and so what happens is that we suggest it by stylistic features, with less pedal, more legato, air legato, staccato, wet legato, tenuto, perhaps less dynamic hairpins, rather dynamic changes of levels, imitating organ or imitating other instruments, voice of course mostly included, repeated melodic notes, as if you change syllables on a piano that speaks only the notes inside the key repeat and not just above, and then legato even in a single note. All these things I teach because I believe that in fact once I wrap them up, I realize that yes, in a certain percentage they all are part of the one single drive when you start the piece. And the piece calls for the different elements that you put in place. And the more you know the piece, you more wisely organize your planning about how to build up, how to reach a given climax of the piece. And you think ahead of what you play so that you can always arrive technically in the best disposition in order to negotiate a given technical process that, I mean, things that have to be obviously more difficult than you can at birth, and then the more you learn, the more they become difficult, because the more you can, the more you realize you can't, and therefore until you manage to make them even and equal, you can sink in the detail, and you should when you work, and then have the endurance and the hope to go above it at some point and just connect them and put them all in perspective, and the micro and the macro, and then deal with the unexpected, share with the audience or the microphone or yourself, and find at the end of it that there is a fulfillment in bettering oneself towards what one wants to serve at best, that means to you because you love it, or because it has a message that beyond love is some kind of a conviction that comes to you. It's not ideology, it's not religion, it's more than that. It's a way of being, it's an idealized system of life, voices behaving in a perfect society, in some kind of polyphony, more than moods and feelings, it's about ways of being in different time periods, translated on instruments that don't correspond, but in which you find ways to relive them and perhaps give them a dimension that, while possibly betraying the original, becomes so beautifully meaningful. And so be it. As a teacher, I go against perhaps my own desire to only connect to the message of what the composer wanted. Is beyond that is what we feel it means to us. And I find that when there is such an honesty and expressive enthusiasm in the performance, audience or critics, of course everybody's critical because nobody agrees, since it's a subjective art by essence, fine, but at least you cannot deny the importance of the conviction and the earnest expression of what your own culture of being brings to the piece that you carry and that you serve, and that you blossoms in front of you ephemerally for one time in front of an audience with whom you share actively. And this reflective and this connected audience becomes part of the piece, and we are all in awe of what we watch this piece, almost like some kind of bright star that makes us dream, marvel, excite, or bewilder, or get lost in our daydreams. Yeah. How much excitement to share.